In 1943, the war looked very different. Across the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, German soldiers were laying down their rifles by the thousands. After the disaster entire units walked toward Soviet lines with their hands raised, exhausted, starving, broken. In North Africa, columns of German and Italian troops surrendered to the Allies in scenes that barely looked like combat anymore. Men sitting quietly beside the road, waiting for captivity instead of death. Surrender had become common, almost routine. By late 1943, Allied intelligence reports showed a clear pattern. German soldiers, once feared for their discipline and determination, were increasingly choosing to live. They surrendered when surrounded. They surrendered when out of ammunition. They surrendered when they knew the war was lost in that sector. Survival mattered more than ideology. But then, something changed. In 1944, Allied troops advancing through France noticed something disturbing. German units that should have collapsed kept fighting. Even when cut off. Even when defeat was obvious. They didn't raise white flags. They dug in. In Normandy, German soldiers defended ruined villages, down to the last man. In the hedgerows, isolated machine gun crews fought until they were killed or blown apart. American and British soldiers began reporting the same thing again and again. They won't surrender. On the Eastern Front, it was even worse. Red Army officers noticed that German resistance had hardened. Units that once broke under pressure now fought until annihilation. Entire battalions disappeared without leaving prisoners behind. Something fundamental had shifted inside the German army, and the question haunted everyone who witnessed it. Why? Why, in 1943, did German soldiers surrender in massive numbers? But in 1944, suddenly choose death instead. The answer was not a single event. It was not a miracle weapon. And it was not renewed hope of victory. It was fear. Fear engineered from the very top. As Germany's military situation collapsed, Adolf Hitler reached a dangerous conclusion. The army was no longer fighting hard enough. In his mind, surrender was not a rational choice, it was betrayal. Weakness, treason, and traitors. Hitler deserved only one fate. In late 1943 and early 1944, orders began flowing down the chain of command. Not suggestions, not guidelines. Commands. Positions were to be held at all costs. Retreat without explicit permission was forbidden. Commanders who ordered withdrawals were court-martialed. Some were executed. Others simply vanished. But the most terrifying message was this: surrender was no longer an option. German soldiers were warned that laying down their weapons would not save their lives, it would destroy them. Not only them, but their families back home. The regime made sure every soldier understood the consequences. Propaganda officers visited units and delivered brutal lectures. Posters appeared at the front. Leaflets were read aloud. If you surrender, your wife and children will suffer. If you desert, your name will be cursed. If you fall into enemy hands, Germany will remember. Behind the front lines, the Gestapo watched closely. Military police units were positioned to stop retreating soldiers. SS detachments were placed near critical sectors, not to fight the enemy, but to enforce loyalty. Some German soldiers discovered the truth the hard way. Men accused of cowardice were executed in public, their bodies left on display as warnings. Others were hanged with signs around their necks, reading "I was a deserter." By 1944, fear no longer came only from the enemy. It came from behind. At the same time, Allied strategy unintentionally made things worse. In 1943, the Allies announced a policy that would echo through every German trench: unconditional surrender. To Allied leaders, it meant clarity, no negotiations, no repeat of World War I's. Armistice, but inside Germany. Nazi propaganda twisted the message into something far darker. Radio broadcasts warned soldiers that surrender meant execution, that Germany would be destroyed, that its people would be enslaved, that there would be no mercy. On the Eastern Front, these fears were reinforced by reality. Stories spread quickly, some exaggerated, some horrifyingly true, of German prisoners dying in Soviet captivity. Whether justified or not, the belief became absolute. Surrender to the Red Army meant death. And so, when faced with a choice between fighting and surrendering, many German soldiers saw only one path that gave even a chance of survival. Fight. Not for Hitler, not for Nazism, but to avoid what they believed would happen if they stopped. By 1944, the German army was no longer fighting as a professional force trying to win a war. It had become a trapped army caught between an advancing enemy and a ruthless regime behind it. Every battle reflected this transformation. In Normandy, soldiers fought to delay, not to defeat. In Italy, units clung to mountain positions long after they were strategically useless. In the Ardennes, exhausted men launched one last offensive not because they believed in victory but because retreat felt more dangerous than attack. And as the war dragged into its final months, resistance grew more desperate, more fanatical, more Aeopoless. By then, surrender was no longer a simple decision. It was a gamble with terrifying odds. In 1943, surrender meant captivity. In 1944, surrender meant punishment. And for many German soldiers, fighting to the death felt like the only choice left. This was not courage. It was control, and it explains why, as Germany collapsed, the war grew deadlier than ever. Because when an army stops believing it can survive defeat, it will fight until nothing remains. Before 1944, the German army was already breaking. The image of the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable machine disciplined, fearless, invincible, had begun to crack long before Allied troops set foot in Normandy. By late 1942, and throughout 1943, German soldiers across multiple fronts were learning a brutal lesson. The war could not be won, and slowly, quietly, many of them began choosing life over loyalty. Nowhere was this more visible than on the Eastern Front. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in February 1943, surrender stopped being unthinkable. Nearly 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity after the Sixth Army collapsed. Officers, medics, engineers, infantry Montire units surrendered together, not because they lacked weapons, but because they lacked hope. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, German soldiers saw an entire army annihilated, not by retreat, but by stubborn refusal to withdraw. Those who survived carried a message back to the front lines. Blind obedience led to destruction. Survival now meant knowing when to stop fighting. As the Red Army pushed westward through 1943, surrender became increasingly common. Isolated German units, cut off by Soviet breakthroughs, often chose to lay down their arms rather than die in frozen fields for ground that no longer mattered. Soviet reports and German records alike confirm a steady rise in prisoners taken during this period. These were not cowards. They were veterans who had seen too much, men who had survived the winter, the hunger, the artillery barrages, and the endless marshes, men who understood that dying for a lost position would change nothing. To them, surrender was not betrayal, it was a rational decision in an irrational war. The same pattern appeared in the South. In North Africa, the German-Italian forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were slowly crushed between Allied armies and overwhelming air power. By May 1943, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and completely cut off from Europe. When the final surrender came, it was almost anticlimactic. Columns of German troops stacked their weapons and waited quietly to be taken prisoner. Many believed captivity in British or American hands meant food, medical care, and a chance to see their families again after the war. And they were largely right. Allied treatment of prisoners in North Africa reinforced the belief that surrender could be a form of survival. German soldiers wrote letters home describing fair treatment, regular meals, and humane conditions. These letters circulated among units, quietly undermining Nazi propaganda that claimed surrender meant death. Then came Italy. After the fall of Mussolini in 1943, Germany was forced into a defensive war across mountainous terrain it could barely hold. As Allied forces pushed north, German units were repeatedly outflanked and isolated. In these situations, surrender became increasingly common, especially when facing Western Allied troops. BTS point morale inside the German army was already collapsing. The promised victory in the east had turned into endless retreat. Luftwaffe protection was gone. Supplies were short. Replacements were younger, less trained, and more frightened. Veterans watched their units shrink month after month, while Hitler's speeches grew more disconnected from reality. But despite everything, one crucial belief still existed. If things became hopeless, you could surrender and live. This belief mattered. It shaped how soldiers fought. It meant they would hold positions, but not forever. It meant they would resist, but retreat when ordered. It meant they would fight as soldiers, not as fanatics. Even officers understood this unspoken rule. Many quietly allowed surrender when further resistance was pointless, prioritizing the lives of their men over impossible orders. In 1943, this still happened. It was risky but possible. The German army in this period was not united by fanaticism. It was held together by routine, discipline, and the faint hope of survival. But this fragile balance could not last. As Germany's strategic situation worsened, the Nazi leadership reached a terrifying conclusion. The army was losing not because it lacked weapons, but because it lacked fear. And soon, that belief would change everything. Because once surrender stopped being seen as an escape, the war would enter its most brutal phase. By 1944, German soldiers were no longer watched only by the enemy in front of them. They were watched from behind. As Hitler's no-surrender orders took hold, the Nazi regime activated its most feared instruments of control, the SS and the Gestapo. Their role was not to fight Allied armies. It was to make sure German soldiers never stopped fighting. SS units were increasingly positioned behind regular Wehrmacht formations, especially in critical sectors. Officially, they were there to maintain order. In reality, they were there to enforce obedience. If a unit retreated without permission, SS men were there to stop it. If soldiers tried to abandon their positions, SS patrols were waiting. If surrender seemed possible, fear ensured it never happened. For many frontline troops, the SS became a second enemy, one they could not escape. Stories spread quickly. Soldiers whispered about men shot for retreating, about officers arrested in the middle of the night, about entire groups punished for the actions of one individual. Whether every story was true no longer mattered. Fear did the work. At the same time, the Gestapo extended its reach far beyond the battlefield. German soldiers knew their letters were not private. Mail from the front was routinely examined for signs of defeatism, doubt, or criticism of the regime. A careless sentence, a moment of honesty, could be enough to trigger an investigation. Men learned to censor themselves. They avoided words like hopeless. They avoided mentioning losses. They avoided questioning orders. Because those letters did not just affect them, they affected their families. The Gestapo monitored wives, parents, and even children back home. Families of soldiers accused of cowardice or disloyalty could lose ration cards, jobs, or housing. Some were interrogated. Others were threatened. A soldier at the front knew that his actions could bring consequences to the people he loved most. This fear reached deep into the trenches. A man might be willing to risk his own life, but risked his family's safety. That was a different matter. By 1944, surrender was no longer just a personnel decision, it was a moral trap. To lay down arms was not only to end your own fight, but to endanger your parents, your wife, your children. Even survival after the war felt uncertain. German soldiers were told repeatedly that records were being kept, that names would be remembered, that traitors would be punished, even if Germany somehow survived defeat. The regime wanted soldiers to believe there was no future beyond obedience, and many believed it. This constant surveillance shattered trust within units. Soldiers avoided open conversations. Officers feared their own men. Any sign of weakness could be reported. Any doubt could be fatal. The result was an army bound not by loyalty, but by terror. By placing the SS behind the front and the Gestapo inside soldiers' homes, the Nazi regime closed every escape route. There was no safe retreat, no safe surrender, no safe silence. The battlefield became a cage, and inside that cage, German soldiers fought not because they believed, but because they were watched. By late 1943, Adolf Hitler was no longer fighting a war against the Allies alone. He was fighting a war against reality. Every map on his desk told the same story. Retreat in the east, collapse in the south, growing pressure in the west. But Hitler refused to accept that Germany was losing. Instead, he searched for someone to blame, and his eyes turned toward his own army. In Hitler's mind, the problem was not strategy, it was surrender. He believed German soldiers were giving up to that commanders lacked will. That retreat had become a habit. And so, in a series of orders that would transform the German army, Hitler made his decision clear. Surrender would no longer be tolerated. The first no-surrender directives were blunt and absolute. Positions were to be held to the last man. Retreat, without explicit authorization, was forbidden. Commanders who abandoned ground no matter the situation would be treated as traitors. For officers, the message was unmistakable: disobey and face court-martial. Fail and face execution. These were not empty threats. Officers were removed from command, arrested, and in some cases shot for ordering withdrawals that saved their men but violated Hitler's instructions. Frontline commanders quickly understood that loyalty mattered more than judgment. Survival now depended not on defeating the enemy but on obeying orders. Exactly, but Hitler went further. Responsibility was no longer individual. It became collective. New regulations declared that if a single soldier surrendered, the entire unit could be punished. Officers were held personally accountable for the actions of their men. This created a terrifying reality on the front lines. One act of surrender could destroy everyone. Soldiers knew this. They were told repeatedly that cowardice would be met with the harshest punishment. Military police units were given expanded authority. Summary executions, once rare, became increasingly common. Fear spread faster than any order. Men began watching each other closely. Trust inside units eroded. A soldier who spoke openly about surrender could be reported. An officer who showed hesitation risked denunciation. In some cases, soldiers were executed not for surrendering but for considering it. Behind the front, disciplined units and military courts worked relentlessly. Trials were swift. Sentences were final. There were no appeals from the battlefield. The purpose was clear. Hitler did not want soldiers who could think. He wanted soldiers who would not stop fighting no matter the cost. By turning surrender into a crime, the Nazi regime reshaped the psychology of the German army. Soldiers were no longer choosing between life and death. They were choosing between two kinds of death. One at the hands of the enemy, the other at the hands of their own leaders. For many, the choice became horrifyingly simple: fight or die as a traitor. By 1944, these orders had taken full effect. German units that would once have surrendered now fought until annihilation, not because they believed in victory, but because the consequences of surrender had become unbearable. This was the moment when the German army truly changed, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. And once fear replaced choice, the war entered its darkest phase. By 1943, the Allies had a clear plan: demand nothing less than unconditional surrender from Nazi Germany. On paper, it was meant to prevent another repeat of World War I. No negotiated peace, no compromising, no halfway measures. Strategically, it made sense that Germany would be forced to capitulate entirely, removing the chance for any revival or secret armistice. But in the hands of Nazi propaganda, this policy became a weapon far more powerful than any artillery or tank. German propaganda quickly turned the concept of unconditional surrender into a story of apocalypse. Radio broadcasts crackled across cities and villages. The Allies demand that we surrender without condition. They will show no mercy. Every German soldier captured will be executed. Every city will be destroyed. Every family will suffer. Soldiers at the front listened. Civilians at home listened, and the message sank deep. For the average German soldier, surrendering to the Allies no longer meant safety. It meant almost certain death, or worse, complete annihilation of everything they held dear. Even men who had once believed in survival and pragmatism began to question everything. The fear was twofold. First, there was the fear of the enemy. Soldiers had seen firsthand the brutal nature of the Eastern Front, where surrendering to the Soviets often resulted in harsh captivity or death. Propaganda amplified this fear, suggesting the same fate awaited anyone captured by Western allies. Letters intercepted by the Gestapo or censored by military authorities could be twisted into proof that surrender meant disaster. Second, there was the fear of the regime itself. Hitler and his officers portrayed unconditional surrender as a betrayal not just of Germany, but of the soldier's own family, honor, and very soul. Soldiers began to internalize the narrative. To surrender was to doom themselves and everyone they loved. The result was chilling. German units that might have considered laying down their arms in late 1943 now dug in. They fortified positions, prepared for death, and refused to retreat. Even when surrounded, outnumbered, or outgunned, many soldiers chose to fight to the last round rather than risk the supposedly inevitable fate waiting behind enemy lines. Allied leaders had intended unconditional surrender to shorten the war. Instead, it hardened the German army's resistance. It played perfectly into Nazi messaging, turning fear into fanaticism and pragmatism into fatalism. What had been a rational option, survival through surrenders, now painted as the deadliest choice of all. German soldiers began fighting not for victory, not for ideology, but for life itself. And paradoxically, the stricter the Allies demanded total capitulation, the more determined German soldiers became to resist, no matter the cost. By mid-1944, this policy, combined with Hitler's no-surrender orders and the Gestapo's omnipresent surveillance, created a perfect storm. German soldiers now faced enemies on two fronts: the advancing Allies in front, and terror from their own leaders behind. The battlefield had become not just a place of combat, but a place where fear dictated every decision, and surrender on un escape had become almost unthinkable. In trying to end the war decisively, the Allies had unwittingly made it far bloodier, far longer, and far more desperate for the men trapped inside Hitler's collapsing empire. On the Eastern Front, the war was unlike anything the German army had ever experienced. Here, survival was never guaranteed, and surrender could be a sentence worse than death. From the moment German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, they faced an enemy that fought with relentless determination. Every village, every river crossing, every forest became a battlefield. Fighting was brutal, close, and unforgiving. The Red Army showed no hesitation, and German units learned quickly that retreat often meant annihilation. But it was not just the ferocity of the enemy that terrified German soldiers, it was the consequences of surrender. By 1944, stories of what awaited prisoners at Soviet hands had spread across the German lines. These were not rumors. They were real cases, documented in war reports and soldier memoirs. Thousands of German posts captured during earlier campaigns, such as the encirclements at Stalingrad and Kharkov, were executed outright, or died under the harshest conditions imaginable. Starvation, exposure to the freezing Russian winter, forced labor, and disease claimed the lives of tens of thousands. Many soldiers who had survived battles only to be taken prisoner never returned home. Entire regiments vanished behind Soviet lines, leaving no trace. The fear of harsh captivity became ingrained. German soldiers watched comrades captured by the Soviets and assumed the worst. Letters sent home by those who survived were censored or delayed, leaving families and friends with incomplete accounts and rumors that exaggerated the dangers. Soldiers filled in the blanks with their imagination, and the picture was horrifying. This fear transformed surrender from a rational decision into a perceived death sentence. Men who might have chosen to give up in 1943 now considered it unthinkable. To surrender to the Soviets meant certain torture, forced labor in Siberia, and likely death. Even the officers were not immune. Experienced commanders, hardened by years of fighting, warned their troops. One step toward enemy lines could lead to years of suffering or immediate execution. Discipline and obedience took on new meaning, not as a matter of honor, but as a matter of survival. The result was terrifyingly effective. German soldiers dug in with ferocious determination. Entire units that might have surrendered in other theaters fought to the last man in the east. Retreats were slow and calculated, and even hopeless positions were defended far longer than strategically necessary. Fear of the Soviets had created an army willing to die rather than risk captivity. By 1944, the Eastern Front had become a psychological battlefield as much as a physical one. German soldiers were trapped between the relentless advance of the Red Army and the brutal consequences of disobedience from their own leaders. Every decision carried unimaginable risk, and surrender was no longer an escape, it was an almost certain path to suffering and death. The atrocities on the Eastern Front did more than kill soldiers, they reshaped the German army itself. They turned men who might have sought survival into fighters who clung desperately to life through combat, making them some of the most determined and deadly defenders in the war, even as Germany's defeat became inevitable. By 1944, the German army was not only trapped by fear and policy, it was trapped by ideology. Nazi indoctrination had deeply embedded itself into the minds of soldiers, shaping their perception of the war as a fight for the very survival of Germany, and by extension, the survival of every German citizen. This was particularly true for the younger soldiers. Many of them were barely men teenagers who had grown up in the Hitler Youth. From a young age, they had been trained to revere the four, to see Germany as a nation under siege, and to believe that personal sacrifice was the highest form of loyalty. Their education was not academic, it was a preparation for death. In battle, survival was secondary. Obedience and the willingness to die were paramount. These young soldiers arrived at the front lines carrying more than rifles. They carried the psychological weight of propaganda and fear. For them, surrender was not an option. To raise a white flag would be not just a personal failure, but a betrayal of everything they had been taught. Their families, their leaders, and the German nation itself. The war, for these men, had been framed as existential. Every Allied advance, every bomb dropped on German cities, every Soviet push from the east was portrayed as evidence that Germany's very existence was at stake. Retreat was painted not as a tactical choice, but as complicity in the nation's destruction. Defeat, in Nazi narratives, was total annihilation. Even seasoned soldiers felt the pressure. Fanaticism and indoctrination created an environment where questioning orders was almost impossible. Units trained in ideology fought not only against external enemies but against their own doubts and fears. The belief that surrender was betrayal and that death in battle was honorable overrode the instinct for self-preservation. By 1944, fanaticism had transformed entire generations of soldiers into relentless fighters. They dug in at hopeless positions, refused to abandon lost ground, and carried out orders with near-automatic obedience. Even when surrounded or outnumbered, ideology made surrender psychologically unthinkable. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Fear alone could push soldiers to fight. Ideology ensured they would do so willingly. Together, indoctrination and terror created a German army that, by mid-1944, would often choose death over the only alternative that once offered a chance at life: surrender. By 1944, the German army was trapped in a spiral of destruction. The fronts were collapsing, supplies were dwindling, and defeat was inevitable. Yet soldiers continued to fight not for victory, but to delay the inevitable. In Normandy, following the D-Day landings, German troops held their positions with relentless stubbornness. Villages were reduced to rubble, headgross became killing fields, and entire battalions disappeared in the chaos of futile counterattacks. Soldiers knew the outcome was inevitable, yet surrender remained unthinkable. Every hour of resistance was a small act of survival, a desperate attempt to slow the Allies' advance. Mons la Terre in the Ardennes, the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, their last major offensive on the Western Front. The attack was ambitious but doomed from the start. Soldiers fought in freezing forests, enduring snow, exhaustion, and dwindling ammunition. Many of them were teenagers, indoctrinated by Hitler Youth programs, carrying the ideology of sacrifice into impossible combat. Again, the goal was not victory, it was delay, buying time for a regime already on its knees. Finally, in Berlin, the capital itself became a fortress under siege. Hermann troops, outnumbered and outgunned, defended streets, buildings, and ruins. The Red Army advanced relentlessly, and surrendering soldiers were trapped between the city and the punishment awaiting them from their own leaders. Here, fighting became absolute desperation. Men fought house to house, block by block, fully aware that death awaited them regardless of the battle's outcome. Across all these fronts, the pattern was the same. German soldiers no longer fought to win. They fought to survive another day, to maintain honor in a collapsing army, and to obey orders that demanded ultimate loyalty. Fear, ideology, and desperation had fused into one unrelenting force. By 1945, surrender was no longer a choice for many. Resistance, even in hopeless situations, became a necessity because for German soldiers, survival meant continuing to fight, even when the war was already lost. German soldiers didn't stop surrendering in 1944 because they believed in victory. The war was already slipping from their hands. Stalingrad, Normandy, the Eastern Front, they had seen defeat, death, and destruction on a scale few could survive. What changed was fear. Terror became the primary motivator. Fear of the SS and Gestapo behind the lines. Fear of punishment for their families back home. Fear of execution for themselves. Fear of the enemy, especially the Soviets, who had a reputation for harsh captivity. Every option was a trap. Retreat could bring death from their own side. Surrender could bring death from the more years of suffering in Soviet labor camps. Obedience, no matter how hopeless, was the only perceived path to survival. However fragile, by mid-1944, German soldiers were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting because the alternative was unthinkable. Every battle became a deadly calculus. One more hour of resistance, one more trench held, one more day survived. And in the end, the most ironic truth of all emerged. The very policy meant to enforce defeat only made German soldiers fight harder, die longer, and surrender less. By 1944, surrender was more dangerous than fighting. History isn't just about battles, it's about fear, power, and control. Every choice a soldier made was shaped by what they feared most. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the front lines of history, hit follow and dive deeper into the world behind the battles. History isn't just battles, it's fear, power, control. Subscribe histcoop for untold war stories.